so many things to bounce off of here. And, there's one specific thing is coming to mind about, of course, in your book, Lies My Government Told Me, which has been kind of an incredible tome to read. But let's start with this. My first thought is, truth-seeking is a very difficult business. I've come to learn over the last 20 years. And especially when you try to tackle things that are very, very difficult for people to accept. For example, having done some of the original reporting on this murder for organs industry in China back in 2006, so many people just simply won't accept that this as a concept. It took me a while, frankly, to grasp the evidence that was presented. I feel like in this space right now, we're kind of faced with these kinds of unbelievable realities. I'm very concerned in part that actually, given this fifth generation warfare 5GW architecture that you've been describing, that this could actually itself be intentional. You don't know what's up, what's down, what's real, what's not. And so the only thing that I know is to try to get at the truth as much as possible, and hope that will act as the North Star, and that will kind of get us through the other side. Okay, first thought. Second thought, I want to talk about your wife, Jill, and this is something a lot of people don't know about, and this comes through in your book, that she actually plays a major role in your writing, in your thought. It's a very, very, very close relationship, both personally, but also academically and in terms of your work. There's this moment in the book where it really struck me. This is the thing that actually made you reevaluate a great many things at the beginning. And I want you to tell me about that, because Jill actually had a book that, well, tell me the story.
So it goes back to this fateful call that we got in the beginning of January of 2020. With Michael Callahan saying, you need to get your team spun up. We have a problem with this novel coronavirus, which at the time had no name. In retrospect, none of us can disambiguate whether that was a genuine alert or whether it was yet another manipulation. Because the timeline and the involvement of the intelligence community in the United States with this novel coronavirus keeps getting pushed back in time more and more and more. But from our lived experience, Jill and myself, I get this call, and Jill and I talk about, what does this mean? I go through this process of threat assessment, and she says, okay, what I can do in this situation is put together a text, a book, a paperback, and self-publish on Amazon. She was a real fan of Amazon self-publishing. She likes to read the self-published novels and things like that. She's an avid reader, and very much the intellectual, wonky woman that seems to have come to the fore in so many ways during the last 3 years. I think one of the key stories that's not readily discussed is the voice of these intellectual women leaders coming to fore, like Whitney Webb, Mary Harrington, my wife, and many others that are voices that we haven't heard before, maybe because they've been drowned out by others that are more endorsed, the blue check crowd, let's say. And she says, okay, the one thing I can do is I can write and self-publish on Amazon a paperback that would speak to the people, the kind of people that we have in our lives, the folks at the feed store, the 18-year-old that helps take care of our horses, friends and family, average people, and alert them to the meaning underlying what has just been disclosed to us by Callahan. And so she gets going on building up, it turns out a little over 100 pages, highly referenced, academic type work, but written for
the layperson.
Common people. Yeah, written for the layperson. to help them to prepare and protect themselves from the novel coronavirus, which doesn't yet even have a name. And she works her can off. We're both sitting there on opposite couches. I'm working on the computational stuff on my laptop. She's working on the book. I edit her stuff. I write a chapter for it about the virus, etc. And she just busts her can and gets it out in the first week in February, which some detractors cite as evidence that I'm deep state because I must have known about this months and months before in order to put out a book in first week in February. But the fact is, as the world now knows, she's a prolific writer, and she did this thing. And her intention was, by doing it as an ebook, in particular, she would have the option, we would have the option of updating it every few weeks as more information comes out, so that the ebook subscriber could buy the one version. Once again, we weren't doing this to make money. She puts it out, and she goes through revision 1, 2, revision 3 in March. And suddenly she can't get revision 3 to go live. And she's like, what's going on? I don't understand it. So she writes to Amazon again and again and again, what's happening here? Finally, they come back and they say, well, we can't publish this. We're gonna have to take it down. And their policy has always been that if they do that, if you're slandering somebody or using inappropriate language or publishing porn or whatever the thing is, whatever the offense is, they will tell you what it is and you can then modify your book and they'll allow it to. That's always been their policy. They won't tell us what's going on. And then finally, we get a message that has these words that we've all come to know and love. We have violated community standards. And yet there's nothing in the Amazon community standards for publication that has anything to do with COVID or viruses or anything that we've said. And people have gone over that book, which is now dated, because it was written before Trump officially, in theory, even knew what was going on. It's hard for me to believe that to be the case, but that's the party line, is the government didn't really wake up until March. And suddenly this thing that she has thrown her heart and soul into has been deleted for violating community standards with no appeal and no opportunity to rectify anything and no details. And she's heartbroken. I mean, think about if you spent a month breaking your back, writing a highly detailed 100-page document just to help people. And then suddenly you're told, you cannot publish this, it cannot be in circulation, nobody can obtain this. Think about the psychological impact. This is her first book. And so she digs in and documents this trail of publication in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others about the collusion, I think is the best word, between the World Health Organization, Amazon, the social media giants, and the White House. And of course, this is all in Trump time, as Peter Navarro would put it. All of these relationships were established then. And what we now know, I didn't know then. I was as influenced by the CCP propaganda as anyone. I believed that people dying in the streets and all of that, the rapid build of the hospital, all that propaganda that got pushed into the US government to justify the China solution that they then employed on all of us. It was really hard to come to terms with the fact that this had all been deployed, and then we learned that it had all been anticipated during Event 201. This was pre-planned. This whole propaganda, censorship, really, I don't know how else to say it, information warfare, psychological operations strategy that we've all been subjected to for the last 3 years. And Jill, in the frame of when this happened, was able to grab these stories that had been posted in these various organs that we now call corporate media or state-controlled media, like the Washington Post and the New York Times, that clearly demonstrated that this was highly coordinated, and what we had just experienced was at the absolute front end, the tip of the spear, or as they like to say, the bleeding edge of the events and the strategy that would then be deployed against the entire world in a harmonized fashion. We have all been subjected over the last 3 years to military-grade psychological operations that were using technology developed for offshore conflicts. And they have been deployed against the citizens of virtually the entire Western world. And as Epoch Times is exquisitely sensitive to, these are the technologies and strategies that are central to the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to maintain control in its information battle space. And we've now had this deployed against us. We're now seeing the documentation on a daily basis released to us by Twitter of this intense collusion between the US government, tech, and corporate media. But for sure, the first kind of radicalization event for Jill and I in our stepwise progression of becoming increasingly disenchanted with the government and what was being done to the citizens, and increasingly attuned to the fact that they are breaching guardrail after guardrail in terms of ethics and the norms of drug development, bioethics, biodefense, pharmaceutical development. All of that has been disregarded in a rush to advance a technology platform that just serendipitously happens to be the one that I played this key role in back in 1989, but has now been perceived as supporting multiple agendas, including convincing a skeptical population that historically has been very wary of genetically modified organisms to allow themselves to become genetically modified organisms. I mean, in a way, you have to admire the technical prowess that has been on display in a global way in this deployment. Is it 10 billion or 13 billion in the United States alone that was employed in this, what else can you call it, PSYOPs campaign to get people to accept products which are neither safe nor effective, and which have not met traditional standards, are not licensed, fully licensed. They're available under this special clause of emergency use authorization. And yet the government felt that it was acceptable to deploy these military-grade technologies against all of us to coerce, compel, and mandate that we accept an unlicensed product that turns out to not be safe nor effective.
You can sort of imagine something like this happening, you know, on a national scale. But it's very hard to imagine, I think, for a lot of people, something like this happening on this global scale. Everybody speaking with the same talking points, the same vision, and oblivious. And this is the hard, the really difficult part, to the many questions around whether it's the lockdown policy early on or the genetic vaccines and, you know, the harms associated with them. And it can be hard to fathom.
Can I respond to that? Because I want to loop back to something you said earlier in your history, your personal story, having to do with your difficulty in coming to grips with the, how else do we call it, fundamental evil of organ harvesting in the CCP and the meaning of that. I think as I've tried to wrestle with this and with people's reflexive revulsion and unwillingness to even allow these discordant thoughts to come into their mind, the possibility that these things might be happening in this way, whether it's organ harvesting or it's the darkness of what appears to be the emergence of a pharmaceutical, corporatist, global centralized state. I think it is a testimony to people's intrinsic goodness. It demonstrates that most people really believe in these fundamental ethics that we could call Judeo-Christian, or there's a number of other words that we could use around this, but the belief system that there actually is right and wrong, that there are ways that civilized people should behave. And to confront the possibility of something so evil, where people are willing, government officials, or who is the puppet master? I have no idea. Or is this just a swarm emergent phenomena? I don't have enough data to disambiguate that, but I do know that this reflexive reaction of people like yourself, in which it's hard for you to even grapple with the possibility of such darkness as a globally coordinated propaganda campaign, harmonized, that involved, just as one example, as I just learned from my trip to Austria that I just came back from yesterday, that involved massive amounts of capital being deployed to essentially buy off artist influencers across the world in a harmonized, simultaneous fashion. That, my friends in Vienna, when I was there, were complaining all of the musicians and the artists and influencers in the arts in Vienna, one of the world's capitals of the arts, were functionally all bought off. They all received money at the outset in order to compel them, coerce them, whatever language we want to use, to endorse these products. Encourage whatever the language. And this is another point I want to make. Language really matters, as Orwell so clearly pointed out in his writing. And we have, not only have we been subjected to this barrage of coordinated propaganda, we've been subjected to a barrage of intentional manipulation of our very language to support this initiative and this agenda. How do we recover from this? How do we recover our innocence? How do we move to a world in which we can trust one another? In an environment in which every single person needs to second think whether or not this person or that person is controlled opposition, where there's always that doubt placed into your mind, where you have to approach every transaction with a modicum of suspicion. How can we form community? How can we form trust? Because in my experience, with decades with clients, you have to give trust in order to get trust. People will not trust you if you don't trust them. It's a reciprocal relationship. It's very subtle in human interactions. And if we're now forced into this environment by these chaos agents, let's call them, these entities that are exploiting this psychological information warfare battlefield towards whatever their objectives are. And I don't think either of us really know what the end point is.
I'm just going to comment, and this is like, there's domestic actors, there's foreign actors, it's just this whole miasma, and they're not all necessarily on the same page. So it's very difficult to see through it in particular. Right?
And some of it is emergent. Mm-hmm. There's in the environment of modern social media, in that battlefield landscape, because that's really what it is, in my opinion. I think it's the best metaphor to think about it, is it is a battlefield, and your mind is the territory that's being fought over. All of the psychopathology that exists in the human species comes out. It's all there. It's all raw. People's all kinds of agendas having to do with their own insecurities, their own desires for power and influence, their need for independent validation. All of these come out and interact in a very complex way with these other forcing functions, these other agendas that are being pushed into the social environment. And it's very, very difficult to disambiguate intentional from emergent phenomena, and from just normal human dysfunctional interactions, bullying and all these behaviors that we all know from our schoolyard days. They're all there on display on a daily basis in this amazing stream of human interactions that we call social media. And they all interact to as Mary Harrington, I think in her lovely Unheard essays, she speaks of this swarm emergent phenomena of consensus that Twitter has been so good at enabling and crafting and shaping. But that's our new world, and it's different.
And there's something particularly disturbing that Mary Harrington notes when talking about this swarmism, so to speak, and it's that there's no locus of responsibility. It's diffuse. And I believe it. I'm even getting shivers up my spine as I say this right now, but that fundamentally turns our whole way of dealing with responsibility, accountability on its head.
Completely. And it's a very DC thing, as I pointed out in that one essay where I speak about this. It's long been the practice here in DC to set up a elite commission on fill in the blank, right? So if you've got a problem, you set up a commission. The members come up with their own assessment and their own recommendations, and they file some study report that people ignore or whatever. And then the decision makers can say, oh, well, we gave it to this commission. And the commission can say, well, this was a consensus opinion. No one of us is really responsible for this. You can't hold anybody on that commission accountable. You can't hold the people that commissioned the commission accountable. It is the perfect kabuki strategy, and it has absolutely been refined to a fine edge here in the imperial capital.